Our last speaker for this afternoon, before we reconvene after a break to have a general discussion, is Aaron Betsky. Aaron, what am I to say? I mean, Aaron knows both sides of the coin as well as the edges. He's a strident art demonstrator and a highly controversial critic and writer who goes every time directly to the point. Aaron was born in Montana, grew up in Holland, and he returned home to America where he became paid up Yale. For he holds both a bachelor's degree as well as a master's degree from Yale in history and architecture. Over his stellar career, he's been director of the Netherlands Architecture Institute, the curator of architecture and design at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, director of the Cincinnati Art Museum, our colleagues around the corner, and is now the current president of the School of Architecture at Taliesin. And ever at the avant-garde, he was the director of the 2008 Venice Biennale, which was titled, as you imagine, Out There, Architecture Beyond Building. Aaron Betsky is one of the main contributors to the spatial interpretation of queer theory. And he has some key books out there that have changed the way and made and paved the way for the way that we see sexuality in space. You know, I was going to end with a quote from Wikipedia, but Aaron said, don't quote Wikipedia. But instead, I will welcome you, Aaron, to our town, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, what do you do after an introduction like that? Just so you all know what's going on with Wikipedia, and if any of you have a Wikipedia page, mind it. Someone who, for whatever reason, has it in for me, got hold of it, and he keeps changing it, and then I keep changing it back, or have it changed back, and he keeps adding in all this bizarre stuff, which he quotes himself, which is really great. Anyhow, be that as it may, it is fantastic to be here. It is, never would I have thought in 1983 that I would actually be allowed to stand on the stage. And I should add, following up on Richard, I am also grateful to the peoples who first occupied this land and brought it to human settlement in probably a much more appropriate way than we have in the century since then. And, you know, when you're in Canada, at every public event, they publicly thank the nations who are there. And I think it's probably a good thing that we should be doing here in the United States as well. What I was asked to talk to you about, I believe, was utopia and the whole notion of utopia, since this is seen as not one, but two utopian settlements that then revive the notion of utopia because, of course, the whole notion of the 1970s, 80s revival was that this would become a new kind of community of enlightened, or as we would say today, woke people who would come together from all different walks of life, from science and art and philosophy and politics, and come to a more spiritual understanding of what not a person was, but what a community was. And we heard earlier today how central that notion of community was in all three of these versions of utopia. Now, the interesting thing about utopia is that we commonly understand it to mean a good place. And that would seem logical because the Greek root of the word EU is good. But in fact, in this case, utopia means not a good place, but an other place. And Thomas More's utopia, which coined the use of the phrase, was meant to propose not a perfect place, not some place to which we should aspire, but another place whose social and political relations, as well as some of its spatial relations, would reflect upon both the good and the bad things present in the England from which he was writing. The notion of utopia was, in other words, not to present some ideal place to which we should aspire, or, heaven forbid, that we should actually make. Rather, it was meant to be a reflection upon where we were today. It was more like what we today, and this is a phrase that was coined by Michel Foucault, would call a heterotopia, a reflective space. I like to use another phrase. We're dealing with a lot of utopian words here, which was coined by the artist Mother Clark, which is an-architecture, which is an architecture that is analogous, an architecture that is also analytic, an architecture that is any possible architecture, and also an architecture that is fundamentally anarchistic, that is against power, that is against the resolution of form in any shape, and the same way that is against the resolution of social relationships into centers of power. Now, the much deeper sense of that utopia is that it is mythic in, again, the Greek sense. It is a place that, like the place of the gods, might have existed at some point in the past, may exist in the future, ontological and eschatological, that might be existing somewhere else. We are just not aware of it, or we can only access it by smelling the fumes of the Delphic oracle, or in our dreams, or through art. That sense of myth became pervasive. And I would argue the problem then became that people tried to build it. And this is where utopia went wrong. People tried to actually realize this other place as a concrete alternative. And as soon as they built it, it was there. It started to age. It was real. So it was no longer another place. It was a place you were inhabiting here and now, and that was both, as such, a fundamental philosophical problem. How do you inhabit a place that's meant to be a reflection on a place? And also a very simple day-to-day problem, which is what killed all utopias. Namely, how do you maintain a perfect life, a perfect community? How are you able to remain in the grace of God while leading your daily life? Christians are still working on this. Other people are working on it in other ways. It seems to be something that none of us, so far, have been able to achieve. Now, that, of course, has not stopped people from building utopias. And the United States, in particular, has been a hotbed, as many writers have documented, for the construction of utopias. And though it has gone down a little bit, the intensity of them, they keep creeping back. Now, what's interesting in the United States is that they take at least 3 different forms that I can think of. The first is, of course, the famous notion of the city of the hill. The notion that you're going to build another place out there somewhere, whether it's Boston or not, that represents Jerusalem. Some would argue that most of California was built in this way, as a promised land at the end of the railroad. That sense of utopia was closely aligned to something we heard about earlier today, which is the imposed utopia, of which New Haven's 9 square grid, along with the plan of Savannah and several other American towns, is a very prominent example. A small group of people who decide that they can, in fact, plan perfection and make all of us live within it, even unbelievers. The third form of utopia is a kind of idealized utopia of art and culture, a notion that if we are all free, if we all wake up, we will come to a realization of perfection, even if our body does other things. Our minds will have this perfect world. And this, to a large extent, was the utopia of which Robert Owen's dreamed, even if the Harmonist predecessor was much more of a religious city on the hill. Finally, as a counter to this, these three models, the city on the hill, the imposed ideal, and the intellectual Luft, palace, sorry, I should translate it into English, the city of air that exists only in your mind, there appeared, starting earlier, but certainly coming to prominence in the 1960s, the notion of what we today call intentional communities, which are self-organizing communities by people who like to believe in the same things, take the same drugs, have the same kind of sex, whatever it is that they like to do. And what's interesting is those have actually turned out to be some of the most enduring communities dedicated to women's power or dedicated to a certain kind of self-sufficiency, and they still survive in various isolated parts of this country. What's interesting to me, and this brings it back, I hope, to some of the discussions earlier today, is that all of these realized utopias were attempts to stage this better world. They are stage sets. And I think the brilliance of this building is that it understood New Harmony as such a stage set, as such a place where heaven can be performed, can be acted out, even if it cannot be permanent, even if we have to continually reinvent it. So the final notion, if you will, of utopia is that it is a kind of stage set, that it is a place that even if it doesn't work, sets the stage for certain idealistic events to occur. And, in fact, the most effective part of utopias, whether it be Brooks Farm in Massachusetts, whether it be New Harmony, whether it be more recent places like Drop City or Arcosanti, is that it has emanated both as a concrete model to be reused and rethought, and in terms of the people that came through here and the influence it's had on visitors. We just heard about Columbus, which is its own kind of utopia, maybe more in the original sense. That has been its real effect and its real influence. As a side note, and I actually don't know whether I'm going to get to my slides, I just want to add that there is actually a related form in the United States that I think has been the most ignored and the most effective form of utopia that this country has built, and it is also the social and physical model that has come closest to achieving some of the dreams of utopia. It also happens to be one of the best, I think, potential export elements of American architecture and educational systems, and that is the American campus, based on English models with a certain influx of Germanic ideas, and their confluence is particularly interesting. But what you wind up with by the beginning of the 20th century is this ideal, and I say here it's an ideal, that you can bring people of all walks and lives, all walks and manners of life, together into one place. You can make a community out of them by bringing them together with a shared purpose to get a degree. And in the process, over 4 years, they can all learn how to become citizens. They can learn all of the knowledge they need to be enlightened, to be woke, to understand where they are, where they've come from, and where they're going. They can then take all of that knowledge and they can go out into the world and make the world better. Using their bright college years, that sense of being a small community and being in this enclosed environment as a model for the kinds of world that they could build. Does it work? Did it ever? A lot of questions, I think, can be asked about it. But I think it remains an incredible model for how we could think of a working utopia, which is a way for me to say that if you want my suggestion, the very best thing you could do in New Harmony is to bring a school here, to have this be a living campus where there actually is thinking, learning, discussion going on. With that, do I have time to just iterate some of those thoughts with some images? It's really just a restatement of what I'm saying. Starting with the perfect idea of utopia. I don't know if any of you recognize this, but it's a really lousy movie. But the image of it is absolutely fantastic. This is Guardians of the Galaxy Part 2. Don't bother seeing it. If it's on Netflix, you can get it for free. That's fine. But the image is that there is this incredible planet that is perfectly organic, where everything grows together, that is also a city, that's also in the brain of its inventor. So this is a person, a place, all of it together. Now, of course, the United States itself was, to a certain extent, a utopian community, actually a confluence of a series of utopian communities, ranging from the agrarian ideals of the Jeffersonians to the statist notions of some of the more capitalist-oriented inventors, to a series of religious utopias that all fused into our current Constitution, that also fused into the very model of the utopian community in America, which of course is Thomas Jefferson's 1814 the university, even way before Ohio, in Virginia. And of course, the gridding of all of the United States, including right here, was part of that utopian impulse. At the beginning of the 19th century, a series of utopias, in the sense of which I was speaking, begin to appear in the East and Midwest, including right here in New Harmony. And in a way, I thought I was going to sort of make people gasp by showing this grand vision for New Harmony, which people tend to forget about. But this really was just a staging ground, a building site for what was meant to be this phalanstère, this place where everyone would engage in free thinking, free love, and collective labor. The model being, if more than anything else, maybe the Shaker villages in all of their stark beauty. This is Brooks Farm, again, one of the less heralded but extremely important American utopias in rural Massachusetts. Very important because every single American philosopher and poet who meant anything, and most artists, came through here and, again, took its ideals out into the rest of the country. One of my favorites, Llano del Rio, which was built in what is today Palmdale, Lancaster, at the intersection, I love this, of Avenue Y and Street X, or X Street. I'm not making this up. You can still find the ruins right there as this perfect circle that was supposed to be a staging of a new spring in America, of course, in the desert. That utopian ideal then informed, and this is a whole nother talk, but those ideals informed and infused the suburban movement, the Garden City movement, and for all of the problems we have today with sprawl, let us please remember that essentially sprawl comes from a utopian impulse, the idea that everyone can be with nature in a small community where they can know each other and have a series of services. That was, to a certain extent, usurped both by companies. This is Pullman, right outside of Chicago, that was built to, as a community where someone came and checked whether you were doing your linen every day, and where you could only buy things at the company store, and where eventually the workers revolted, almost causing a revolution in the United States. The other thing that, of course, usurped it was developers who turned it into Levittown, but again, there is always this impulse to take it back to an idealized community such as that of Columbia, Maryland. And again, my favorite Sea Ranch, 3 hours north of San Francisco, laid out by Lawrence Halpern, danced to life by his wife, a famous choreographer, and filled out by a group of very talented architects led by Charles Moore to be this site where intellectuals could come and commune with nature. Arco Santi on the bottom, created by another child molester as a place to build a utopian community in the desert, and above that, Drop City in Colorado. I bring you, again, back to the notion of the campus. The idea at the University of Virginia was that each of these houses would be a small community where a master would work with a series of students, of course, then all male, and they would together group around a larger community, which was that where the library was, where the knowledge was stored, and would look out to the landscape to which they would return, and that they would then propagate, ideally, with these kinds of ideal architecture. The fact that they were all woven together by slave quarters makes it quite difficult to use as a model, but use it as a model, I'm afraid I will anyhow. And then finally, the best of all campuses, of course I can't say that anymore because you gave away my education, but that of Yale University. And my first book was actually on the architect James Gamble Rogers, who did most of this architecture. And what's really remarkable is that the president of the university at that time, who was a Dewey disciple, the largest donor, and Rogers literally conspired behind the scenes to create an idealized community based on the fact that James Gamble Rogers found that his son, who was attending college, was becoming an overweight drunk who didn't have a community to be part of. And so to give his son a sense of being part of a community, they created this kind of utopian place. And that finally, what's interesting is that the assistant, the secretary, who was the secretary assisting them in writing all the plans, went on to head the University of Chicago, and then went on to found the University of California, Santa Cruz, which became the last of the great utopian campuses that was built in the United States. I would argue today that where you are finding these kind of utopian communities is in the rehabilitation and reuse of our industrial heritage, whether it's in the Ruhr of Germany, or this is the latest, which is the rehabilitation of the world's largest steel mill in Beijing as the site of the 2022 Winter Olympics. This notion of re-inhabiting and rehabilitating the past for an utopian community is, for me, what really is at the core of what we should be thinking about in terms of utopia. This is a former sanatorium in Belgium turned into a new kind of psychiatric institute where the community runs, based on the ideas of Ivan Illich and various other people, runs the community themselves and uses its ruinous quality to have a kind of clarity about where they are. This is Wade Guten's community, the Heidelberg in Detroit, where he took the burned out part of Detroit and created the nucleus of a new place there. Of course, the former High Line in New York, opening up the city, even though it's been taken over by capitalism and huge crowds. This is one of my favorites. I wish I could spend more time on this. Mexico has a program by which everyone has to pay through their paychecks for social housing. They've used those tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to build well over 500,000 horrible prisons for poor people to live. a young architect took charge of that program, it's called InfoNavi, and said, we can do better, took the money and started opening up, rehabilitating those existing social housing structures and turning them into places of community. The project in Barcelona, where they needed a new public park to overlook the city, the young architect said, let's turn this into community, let's tear down only what we need to be able to get the view and leave only as much as we need so that people won't kill themselves. They can hurt themselves, they just can't kill themselves. And let's turn this into a gathering place for this working class community. And then finally, this is the Torre David. Those of you that watched Homeland must have experienced it for a season. It was a 50-story skyscraper in Caracas that was never finished. And one night, a group of squatters took it over up to the 25th floor, created a community there for a good almost 10 years until Maduro finally got rid of them. And a young architecture group called Urban Think Tank, together with the photographer Iwan Ban, went in there to look at this community and say, how is this really a community? So those are some of the issues that I'm interested in trying to figure out at our own utopia at Taliesin, where we are trying to figure out how to build a better world based on Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy. And I will just fast forward to say that at the core of what we're doing there is to create a community based on learning, based on figuring out how we can make the world around us more sustainable, more beautiful, and more open. And we do this in a very concrete way by having all of our students design, build, and occupy their own desert shelters before they're allowed to graduate, so that each one of these shelters becomes an experiment in community, in architecture, in learning, in talking to each other, and in figuring out how you can, in fact, build a better world. So that's what we're trying to do at Taliesin. Come see us there, or I look forward to coming to see the University of New Harmony sometime very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Any questions before?
Is it Taliesin East or West you're talking about?
We are actually Taliesin. We spent half the year at the original Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin. And then we migrate. I'm here right now, mid-migration. Right now we're driving to Taliesin West, where we will spend the next 7 months living out in the desert before returning to Spring Green in the spring.
About how many students do you have?
We have only 25 students, but we want a lot more. So never too old to get a degree. Have another one.
Okay, folks. Well, Richard.
I think Wakanda would be a better utopian village than Guardians of the Galaxy.
I disagree. I think Wakanda's horrible. But we can have a discussion about that. What's that?
Wakanda has an archive and they use it.
Let's talk about that.
Okay, folks. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then Aaron will lead a conversation with all the speakers of this afternoon. Thank you again.